So we know now environmental toxins, big player in this. Let's talk about the physiology, whether it be food, air, water. When these chemicals come into the body, take me through how that leads to Parkinson's.
Yeah. So when Dr. Parkinson described the disease in 1817, he wasn't sure where the disease began. He thought it might begin in part of the brain. And he said he looked forward to anatomists who would determine where the disease began. In 2003, a really, really smart German pathologist named Heiko Brock came up with a new idea. He said that Parkinson's disease does not begin in the brain. He said that Parkinson's disease, which we think of as brain disease, does not begin in the brain. He said, after I looked at hundreds of brains, I see that the pathology of Parkinson's disease, a misfolded protein, I see it beginning in either the smell center behind our nose, called the olfactory bulb, or I see it in cells that give rise to the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve, as some of your listeners know, goes from the lower part of your brainstem all the way down to your gut. It's like 2 feet long, depending on how tall you are. And so he thought that Parkinson's was due to neural invasion of some kind of pathogen. He thought a virus. A virus has probably played a small role in most cases of Parkinson's, but a pathogen that crosses in from the gut and crosses the membrane in the gut leads to the pathology of the disease. And as the pathology of the disease spread up the vagus nerve and up through the brain, as the pathology spread like a fall of a row of dominoes, new symptoms would appear. If you damage the vagus nerve, which is responsible for digesting your food, you get constipation. The pathology then can spread from the lower part of the brainstem a little bit higher, right above it, are our sleep centers. If the pathology spreads towards sleep centers, we get fragmented sleep. We get people acting out their dreams at night, perhaps striking their bed partner, called REM sleep behavior disorder. A little bit higher from the sleep center are the part of the brain that's classically affected in Parkinson's disease, called the substantia nigra, which gives us either tremor and slowness in movement. And then as you spread up further and further, you get to the parts of the brain that are responsible for thinking. And then late in the course of the disease, you might get troubles with thinking and dementia. The spread of like a falling row of dominoes, the pathology spreads. And as the pathology spreads, so do the symptoms. So that begins in the gut. So in 2019, a really smart colleague of mine, Dr. Per Borkhammer in Denmark, said there are two forms of the disease of Parkinson's and related diseases. There is this gut first form of disease. He calls it a body first form of disease that Dr. Brock described, beginning with the vagus nerve. And he said there is a nose or brain first form of disease that begins in the smell center of the brain. Dr. Brock didn't make much of the pathology beginning in the nose, but Dr. Borkhammer thinks that for most people with Parkinson's, it might be even more important, and that it can spread the pathology from the smell center backwards to the part of the brain that's if you controlled in mood, called the amygdala, and part of the brain that controls movements, the substantia nigra. Two forms of the disease, one beginning in the gut, body first form of Parkinson's disease, one beginning in the nose, brain first form of disease. I sent him an email saying, this is outstanding work. Congratulations. How does this fit with chemicals that we ingest, that we eat, that we swallow, like the Marines at Camp Lejeune drinking the contaminated well water, leading to a gut or body first form of the disease, and chemicals that we inhale, like the fields being sprayed with Paraclot, leading to a nose or brain first form of the disease? He said he hadn't thought about it, but we put this hypothesis together, saying that chemicals we ingest lead to a gut or body first form of the disease, chemicals that we inhale leading to a nose or brain first form of the disease.
And depending on the mode of getting Parkinson's, how different are signs and symptoms later on?
Yeah, so if you start in the gut, you get early constipation, then it spreads up to the part of the brain that controls sleep. You get sleep disturbances, then it spreads up to the part of the brain that controls tremor, and you get tremor. It also affects parts of the nervous system that we don't control, like the autonomic nervous system. So people might get lightheadedness or something like that. Conversely, if it begins in the nose, one of the earliest features of the disease might be loss of smell. I told you it goes to the amygdala, which might be involved in mood, so you might get a little anxiety, and then it goes back to the brain. importantly, he thinks that the disease generally begins in a single locus. It's not spread all over, so that when it begins in a single locus, at a single site, that means that, for example, that most of that Parkinson's disease for people who begin in the nose is really asymmetric because 99% of nerve cells connect to the other nerve cells on the same hemisphere of the brain. And so people get this asymmetric tremor that's much worse on one side of the body than on the other side of the body. And then only later in the course of disease does the other side get affected. So his mapping, which has been supported by pathological studies and imaging studies, and people who are still living, we can image different parts of the nervous system, really plays well with what we know about the natural history of the disease.
Okay, so it sounds like by what you just said there, if our origin is through the nose, that one side will be affected, at least earlier on, versus the gut would be more
so the gut,
centralized.
It turns out the gut, sorry, a little extra neurology. I had to review this. It turns out the gut is it's innervated by the vagus nerve on you have two nerves. You have a right vagus nerve and a left vagus nerve, just like you have a right ulnar nerve and a left ulnar nerve. You have a right vagus nerve and a left vagus nerve. Turns out that both vagus nerves go to the gut, so that the pathology begins in the gut. It can spread up both the right vagus nerve and the left vagus nerve. So people who have a gut first form of Parkinson's disease, this is hypothesis, is that their Parkinson's disease will be relatively symmetric or less asymmetric than people who begin with the nose, where 99% of the neurons are connecting to nerve cells on the same side of the brain.
Okay. Since the prognosis takes so long after our initial exposure, somebody say they've been to one of the Marine bases, but they're still feeling healthy, but they feel like they're exposed, or they grew up by a field where farmers were spraying right in their vicinity. What I'm getting at with all this, before they get Parkinson's, knowing they've likely had exposures to these chemicals, has there been any research showing detox protocols are helpful, removing them before problems fully arise?
No. In short, no one's like this hypothesis. Dr. Borghammer was 2019, but that's a great idea. And there are studies, Michael J. Fox Foundation, working on trials that would give you treatments, drugs, for example, to see if this can prevent onset of disease. Now, people are looking for solutions that don't require drugs, right? And, people don't want to be patients. So what can we do? I think we can stop getting exposed to these chemicals. So I don't think if you drink well water when you were young, if you breathe in pesticides because you live near a golf course or a farm, if you served at a contaminated bait, I don't think it's a fait accompli that you're necessarily going to develop the disease. And I'll give you an example. So if you smoke cigarettes, it's not a fait accompli, when you smoke cigarettes in your 20s that you're going to get lung cancer in your 60s. Turns out within hours of smoking your last cigarette, your heart rate normalizes. Within days, your carbon monoxide levels in your blood decrease. Within months, your cough and shortness of breath decrease. Within a year, your risk of heart attack is lower. And within 10 years of smoking your last cigarette, your risk of lung cancer is halved. If this is true for smoking and lung cancer, why wouldn't this be true for getting exposed to these chemicals and Parkinson's disease? I think if you've had these early exposures in childhood, as a young adult, as a teenager, you want to take action right now to stop being exposed to these chemicals. So you stop fueling the fire. So you stop letting the spread of this pathology go up your vagus nerve or from your nose back to the part of the brain that's classically affected in Parkinson's disease. We'd also know that exercise, for example, can reduce your risk of developing disease. Exercise releases growth factors in the brain that might be really important if you've had these early exposures. We know that a Mediterranean diet, low in animal products, high in fruits and vegetables, is associated with a decreased risk of developing disease. So I think there's lots of non-pharmacological interventions that are logically, and there is evidence for these things playing a role in reducing a risk of getting disease, and might be especially important if you've had these exposures to these chemicals, or you're the child of someone with Parkinson's disease, for example.
What I was getting at, though, we know TCE, PCE, they build up in the fat tissue. And say somebody knows that their fat tissue is likely loaded with these, but their substantia nigra isn't yet destroyed. and say they're in that 10-year period before they have major problems and they have full-on Parkinson's, things like saunas, binders, getting the chemicals out of the body before they have full-on Parkinson's. Any research there?
Largely, no. I'll give you something. So I've been looking at ALS, and turns out the environmental risk factors for Parkinson's disease, air pollution, solvents, dry cleaning chemicals, pesticides, and heavy metals are in many cases very similar to the environmental risk factors for Parkinson's disease. One of the kings of neurology was this neurologist named Dr. Lewis or Bud Rowland. He was so eminent that he was the chair of Department of Neurology at Columbia University, and before he was the chair of neurology at Columbia University, he was the chair of neurology at the department at the University of Pennsylvania. And in the 1970s, he described the case of ALS that was due to lead poisoning. The person had worked in a battery plant for 30 years before being diagnosed with ALS at age 50. He came under his care and then of his colleagues, and a year later, when he was 51, and he gives this person a chelating agent called penicillamine to reduce his lead levels were elevated, and it reduced his lead levels of elevation, and his weakness got better. I think we need to do the research that you were exactly suggesting that we do. What are the interventions that we can do for people who have been exposed, people who are at high risk for developing these conditions? Why aren't we measuring these chemicals in people's bodies? If we know that pesticides, dry cleaning chemicals, air pollutants, metals are linked to Parkinson's, which they are, why aren't we measuring these chemicals in people's bodies? We measure cholesterol in 50,000 different variations of cholesterol every day. We measure hemoglobin A1C every day. Why aren't we measuring these chemicals that we know are linked to Parkinson's and to ALS and to Alzheimer's disease so we can take action? One, find out if we're at risk, and then two, study interventions to reduce these levels in our bodies so we can create a world where we can prevent these diseases from ever occurring in the first place. We just haven't done it. There's no money being done to this. Out of every Parkinson's research dollar, only two pennies is spent on trying to prevent the disease. 60% of biomedical research funding in the United States is for pharmaceutical firms and medical device firms, and they're largely in there, trying to come up with new treatments to the disease, and we're getting better treatments for cancer and the like. But I think what people want is they don't want to be cured of their breast cancer. They don't want to be cured of their prostate cancer. They just don't want to get the disease in the first place. And almost nothing, almost no attention, almost no money, almost no energy is being spent on trying to prevent Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's disease or ALS. Sometimes I think I wake up in the morning, I think about preventing Parkinson's disease. That's what I do. When I come in the morning, I'm thinking about preventing Parkinson's and other brain diseases. But I think there are really, really few people like me in the country and the world, and we need to get more and more people involved. Just because we live in a world without typhus, we live in a world without polio, we live in a world without smallpox. These are all diseases that we have said goodbye to. It is long overdue for us to say goodbye to Parkinson's disease.
And just to be clear, I'm all for prevention and having good treatment strategies, but I also think that we need to put a bunch of focus in the middle of people that have been exposed, and
100%.
They're not just sitting there like a ticking time bomb waiting for things to go off. Like you said, testing. Let's see what's going on in the body chemical-wise, and then let's look at procedures we can use to clean that up to prevent that middle group from ever getting Parkinson's.
So let's talk about pesticides. So pesticides are, many of them are designed to kill insects, and they're designed to kill the insects by damaging the nervous system. Not terribly surprising that you get exposed to some of these pesticides or insect-killing chemicals, that they might damage your nervous system. And it's almost certain that a neurologist like me has seen people who develop neurological disorders because of exposure to pesticides. But until 3 months ago, or maybe 5 months ago, maybe 6 months ago, I work at a new organization called Atria Health and Research Institute, New York City. It's focused on moving healthcare from reactive sick care to proactive preventive care. Until 6 months ago, I had never ordered a pesticide level in my life. And now when I see someone with Parkinson's disease, I order pesticide levels, I order levels of metals, and I check their urine for trichloroethylene. Because if I can find these chemicals in them, then we're going to open the door to figure out why are they getting exposed to these chemicals, even if it's been years after the fact. And maybe it's gone in their body from now, but for some people, they still might be drinking the well water, for example, and they still might be getting exposed to pesticides. We can find these chemicals in them. We can take action to reduce that exposure, and then we can think about what interventions can we think about to reduce the risk of progression or lower the risk of ever getting the disease. The guy I'm sitting right next to is Dr. Rob Konchko. He's a fantastic naturopathic doctor, and he's teaching me about all types of things I didn't know anything about because, I grew up going to medical school, and we're really taught to be deeply skeptical of these alternative approaches. But I think there's some truth to some of these alternative approaches, and we have missed the boat on addressing the root causes of many of these brain diseases.
Since you made it to the end of this clip, I know you're going to love the full episode. Click here to watch. I'll see you over there.
This problem is all around us, but almost no one's paying attention to it, and we're all paying a really, really high cost for this in terms of cancer and likely Parkinson's disease. Only about 13% of people